I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament Podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. In this episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, our guest, writer, photographer, tree hugger, animal lover, and dissident, Kollibri Terre Sonnenblume. Kollibri joins us to add some deeper notes to a recent piece he wrote. Please welcome a voice for life, sanity, and peace, Kollibri Terre Sonnenblume. Okay. Well, Kollibri Terre Sonnenblume, thank you so much for joining me here on the Poetry of Predicament podcast on a beautiful Sunday afternoon. I hope it's as beautiful down there as it is here in Southern Oregon.
It's really nice here today. Yeah, I'm in the town of Joshua Tree, and it's about 70 and sunny.
Great. Joshua Tree is just one of the most sacred and beautiful spaces I got to grow up in, and a lot of rock climbing memories, a lot of psychedelic journeys, and so on.
Nice.
The body of work that I'm involved with here in Living Resilience and all the stuff that goes with it, including the Poetry of Predicament podcast, is really to support people with as much resources and ways of being resilient in the face of the collapse of Earth and human systems. And
right.
I've got to say that the CounterPunch article that I was sparked by, that I read in order to find out about you and give you a shout out to talk with me here, is what I found in writing now my second book about all this stuff. There are extraordinarily large influences that I've found to be just not talked about. If it's possible that there's something bigger than the elephant in the room that we're all not talking about it, it's very clear to me that something at the scale of extinction that's in the middle of the room that we're not talking about, in addition to other just slightly smaller infinities that you started to talk about in your article. Now you talked, really, I think the focus that I recall was that you were talking about that our focus on the president of the United States, the presidency and the elections and all that it may well be one of the primary things that takes us down when we focus our attention in that way and on those things that really have no bearing on the scale of what we really are confronting. First, let me just stop there and ask you, is that a fair, brief synopsis of what you're saying? And is there a place you would like to start as you talk about your own writing and what you were meaning to say?
That's a completely fair synopsis. Yeah, basically the article was just saying that paying so much attention to the presidential race and indeed just to the office itself is a distraction from the work that we need to be doing, and that no matter who's in that office, that person is going to have to be pressured a great deal in order to do whatever that office can do, which, is also limited, but there are things that the government could do if it was pressured to do it, Congress and everyone,
Yeah. Well, the thing that I would like to just dive right into, if you're okay with it, is
go for it.
One of those infinitely large elephants in the room is our utter fixation on all things military. And
Yeah.
to me, that really just to kind of betray a little bit of an upcoming book that I've got coming out. I really think we're anchored, we're founded, we're a country and a global human operating system founded on the delivery of trauma and violence in order to maintain a particular structure of culture. And there's just no more graphic example of that than our military in the USA. And I love how you point out in the article that the U.S. Military is indeed the largest institutional consumer of fossil fuels on the planet, in addition to being quite, I think, arguably the largest polluter in the world.
That's right.
Is there anything you'd like to say more about that?
The issue of the military of the United States is also being ignored because of the focus on the presidency, because there is no one who runs for that office who is truly anti-war or anti-military, who gets any attention,
Yeah.
and so there's another instance where focusing on this race and getting all excited about these different candidates means that we're ignoring what would have to be addressed in order to address anything else. I mean, there's certain candidates out there that are very popular with people who are talking about, healthcare, free education, et cetera. And these things, in order to be paid for, would necessitate deep cuts in the military, and yet those deep cuts in the military are not being proposed by these same candidates.
Right.
I mean, Bernie Sanders is basically the prime example of that one, who's been getting a lot of attention and a lot of support, but who is not by any stretch of the imagination an anti-war or an anti-military candidate.
Right. Right.
And that's what we need to do. And obviously this is a deep issue in the United States because the nation was founded on violence through the genocide of the Native American people, and then it was made wealthy through violence against the Africans who were brought over here as slaves, and then we sort of took our place on the world stage, declared ourselves, the global empire by nuking 2 cities in Japan, and so the violence has been there from the very beginning, and has always been in the forefront. And it's funny. It's something that's so in the forefront that people somehow miss it. I guess the way that people talk about how does a fish know that it's in water or whatever. That's kind of how it is. The militarism is the air we breathe in this country.
Yeah, I think that's brilliantly put. I remember one of the earliest cartoons that I can recall that was other than the Sunday cartoons in the newspaper was one of 2 dolphins jumping out of the water, and one pointing down toward the water with its flipper saying, "There, that's the stuff I've been telling you about." Yeah, I'll see if I can dig that up.
That's great.
On the screen while we're talking, and in the ultimate in the end of this production. So I'm wondering if I could ask you kind of a more on the personal end of the question. In this work, I'm asserting that there are a tremendous number of kind of blind spots or weaknesses that we have in our culture that come out of that foundation that you've been describing. One of them is that we seem to be grief phobic, death phobic, and pain phobic, and so we'll go to extreme lengths to keep from feeling or grieving and so on. I'm wondering if you have anything to say about the cost to our psyche in founding ourselves in that violence and the delivery of trauma. who are we becoming, and who have we become with that kind of a foundation? Do you have anything to say about that?
Yes, certainly. I mean, it's all of a piece. I mean, the work that we need to do in the world, in the material world, to change things, obviously cannot be separated from the work that we need to do on ourselves. Some people would call this spiritual work. Some people would call this psychological work, but they're referring to the same thing: is that there's internal or interior work that we need to do as well that goes with it, and it's all of a piece. Mm-hmm. I wrote an article a couple of years ago about the Russiagate, nonsense, and how I was fearing that the Russiagate story was increasing the chances of nuclear war between the United States and Russia. And in writing about the piece, I was also at that time, it was a couple of years ago, I was camping in the desert down here, and I just mentioned at the beginning of the piece that, like, I'd been out in the desert for a month. I came in and I was like, couldn't believe that this Russiagate thing was still in the news. And I wrote this article and I posted it up, and someone made a comment on the article and said, oh, well, it's not like, meditating in the desert is going to, solve our problems, And it's like, well, no, but we can't solve our problems without meditating in the desert either, metaphorically speaking. We need both. The work needs to be happening on both of us at once, on all of aspects of ourselves, culturally and collectively, but then internally too. I'm sure you've heard of J.D. of Jiddu Krishnamurti, and he speaks about this very eloquently, more eloquently than I could.
Yes. I'm curious if, just to orient you to where I tend to be in this body of work, and then many of the folks who listen to this podcast and so on, is, we sometimes call ourselves collapsitarians. Folks who really see it, we're in the middle of collapse and it's really imminent. What hasn't already started will be starting soon, kind of a point of view about our world, both in the earth systems and human systems. And I'm curious what you see out ahead. Let's just pick a year out at like 2050. And given your perspective and obviously being a thoughtful author and just human being, as you obviously have been, what do you see in our future out at around 2050?
2050, let's see, that's like 30,
that's about
a little over 30 years from now.
Yeah.
Things could be so incredibly different 30 years from now, mm-hmm. Just projecting forward from now, because so far the theme in climate science has been, oh, we thought that wasn't going to happen for another 10 years. Oh, we thought that wasn't going to happen for another 20. Oh, this thing that just started, we thought that wouldn't start until 2050. And so for that reason, I think that if you want to project a pretty drastic scenario by 2050, that could be a conservative thing to do at this point. When you look at how quickly things are changing, I think that it's hard to imagine there still being this many human beings living in the world at that point, mm-hmm. Considering the fact that so many cities will be getting flooded, and more importantly than that agriculture will be failing at a massive scale. I was a farmer for 10 years, a small-scale organic farmer. And the last year I did that was the spring of 2013. And already at that point, it was becoming difficult just to grow vegetables because of the swings and extremes that were happening. And this was in Oregon, up in the Willamette Valley near Sandy. And that's one that people aren't paying attention to either, is the fact that, it's going to be a lot more difficult to grow food, and we're already having more failures than we did before. And so, unfortunately, starvation is probably in the picture before 2050.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm afraid we're pretty close in terms of orientation to that kind of prediction. Um, I'm also curious, given how much you're aware of on a global and obviously national scale. I'm wondering if there's anything that particularly hits you in your own heart, really moves you about what's going on. And if I may, again, just an example, I I've always been an ocean person, really. When I need to recharge my inner batteries, when I need to reconnect my heart to life, I tend to go to the ocean. And it's been particularly hard for me to track with the decimation of various ocean habitats around the world, and of course the species extinction and downfall of coral reefs, and on the list goes. So that's my particular kind of hardest element to hold in my heart. I'm wondering if you have something similar that either in the earth systems or the human systems that really moves you in particular.
Maybe the insects.
Mm-hmm.
I think I was a great lover of insects from a child. I raised caterpillars in the screened boxes. I would put fresh food in every day until they made their cocoons, and then let them go when they came out. And that was a fun activity, and it was also a good activity, for a young man to be nurturing towards another life form. And definitely the decrease in the insect population is just heartbreaking, besides the practical aspects of that I'm also aware of, how they have such a key place in the food chain, and that without the insects kind of everything else collapses. But even besides the practical end of it, just there's this deep sadness about the fact that, like, well, the monarch butterfly on the West Coast is now 98% gone or something like this,
Yeah.
I mean, that's just that's tragic, I mean, it's hard to pick one thing. I'm also a plant person, and all the different plants that are suffering at this point too, and then that being exacerbated by the fact that as the climate changes and plants are starting to move around, and plants from new areas are coming in and taking over as the conditions change and are no longer good for the native plants that were there, to see people going in and killing the new plants. You see a lot of this, it's done under the banner of, quote, invasive species, and that's also a very, that one's very heartbreaking to see too, because for me, all of these creatures are sentient, are as sentient as humans. It's just a different flavor of sentience. It's a different kind of sentience. But to me, they all have a consciousness. All the plants and all the animals. They're not any less than any of us. The ant is no less than me. I am no greater than the ant. For example. And so seeing that I'm not playing favorites with humans on this. I hate to see all the suffering that's happening to humans, and it's going to happen over the next few years. But I'm no less sad about all the other suffering.
Yeah. It sounds like you might have read a bit of Derek Jensen's work.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate a lot of his work. His recent book about the myth of human supremacy was really good, and no one else has made that point as well as he has, I think.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. He's a precious gift to our community. So, what do you think it's going to take to rattle us enough so that we can shift some part of this? What's obvious, I think, to anyone who's even slightly aware of our global and especially our national situation, that there's a huge encasement in denial and in resistance to being aware of what's going on, especially about the topics that you bring up in your article, and you just mentioned them a little while ago, like that we just can't talk about how saturated we are in violence and in the delivery of trauma, and also in the militarism that makes that functional and real in the world. How do we shift that? How do we crack that nut so that something else has a chance to come in?
I think here in the United States, we need to look beyond ourselves and our culture here. We have to look outside of it, honestly. And I think that within the borders of the United States, we should look first to the indigenous, to the Native Americans who are here, who are still connected and who would have some things to say about it. And then beyond that, globally, we should be looking to the global indigenous people and to the youth for answers. And I think that it's kind of a form of American exceptionalism to consider that we would even be able to come up with the answers ourselves. Or I think it's beyond us at this point, and that's maybe the first thing we need to do is be like, oh, you know what? I don't think we can do this. I think we need to step down, look around, and be like, okay, someone else needs to take the reins here. How can we hand them over? How can we individually and collectively look to other people to lead this one? That's what I would say about it.
Got it. You mentioned something else in your CounterPunch article. You had quite a bit to say about what are we standing for? What are we? There was a way in which you put it. You actually were quoting. Gosh darn it! I'm sorry, I'm not going to remember it right now. The point was that with our attention on who's in office, we are clearly destined to fail, to continue failing. And you juxtapose that to, so what if we put our attention on who's sitting in, instead of who's sitting in the office of the presidency, who's sitting in any number of different activist situations, sitting in at government offices, sitting in on the streets, as it's being done by so many, students and Extinction Rebellion and on right now. Can you take us a little bit down that direction? Because you, as far as I understand it, you give that some possibility of making a difference.
Yeah, that was a Howard Zinn quotation that's pretty well known, where he says it's not important who's sitting in the White House, but who's sitting in at the lunch counters in the factories, on the streets, et cetera. And so he was talking about, mass civil disobedience. And Chris Hedges speaks really well about this right now too, and has lately, about how that is what to do in the United States would be massive, nonviolent civil disobedience. Nonviolence being important simply because the violence that the state can bring to bear against us is so much greater that there's no contest there. There's no way to win that one. The people who think it's important to defend the Second Amendment in a certain way because they feel like they can protect themselves from the government are being a little delusionary, because the government has the citizenry outgunned, and simply, that's not going to happen that way, and so yeah, like massive movements of many thousands of people, millions of people, really, saying and acting in a way that business as usual is simply not going on anymore. So this means people not going to school. This means people not going to work. This means all of that, and demanding change. Now, it's hard to imagine that in this country, and so probably something like that wouldn't happen here until it was happening in other parts of the world and was really inspiring people here. I think people here would have to see it working for someone else first, because people have been really beaten down here first by the system, and made to feel helpless and made to feel powerless, even though ultimately they are not. And there's also the argument that at this point in U.S. history, we've simply collectively run out of energy ourselves. That this whole thing is kind of running down. Like it's not even possible to think of doing something like building the interstate highway system or something.
Mm-hmm.
So unfortunately, what we need is hard to imagine. And I don't think it's impossible. I don't think it's impossible, but it doesn't seem very probable at this point. That's why the youth out on the streets last Friday was such an encouraging sign.
Yes. Yeah. Well, it's funny to meet someone just after having read your brief piece in CounterPunch, and now just a few minutes of conversation, to have such a remarkable amount of alignment. I don't know how it is for you, but from time to time, this can become a lonely conversation. It seems like the willingness to speak truth to power, and also just literally speak the truth of what we're seeing, whether it's to power or not, even especially actually if it's in our circles, intimate others, family, friends, neighbors, co-workers. This can be a heretical conversation, really, depending on who we're talking with. And sometimes that can be a bit lonely. So it's interesting to then every once in a while bump into someone that there feels like there's a lot of resonance between how you're describing what you see in the world and what I'm experiencing. So I'm just appreciating that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate talking to you as well. And I would say that I've thought about that topic as well. And I think that one way to feel less isolated is to also think about things in terms of time, which is to say that there's been a mainstream of history, sort of a main course of history that's been happening for thousands of years, and that since agriculture really is where I would put it, has been becoming more and more destructive over the centuries, with sort of an uptick in the destruction happening with the industrial age, of the last 250 years or so. But anyway, alongside that, there's always been a side stream. There's always been people looking on the fringes or from the outside, looking in and saying things about it. So it's not as though people who are aware of how destructive things are now, it's not that we're the first people ever to be aware of this, not at all. People have been aware of it the entire time.
Yes.
You can look at, for example, the Romantic poets of the 19th century who were around, or earlier, who were looking at the Industrial Revolution that were unfolding. They were seeing the attacks on nature that were happening, and they were like very sad about it and very eloquent about it at the time. So that was one set of voices there that was already, that was on the outside looking in and being like, oh, hey, this route that we're taking collectively here, this isn't working. And here's where it's going to go if we don't pay attention. And so in that way, that's one way in which you can feel less alone too, is to realize that we're part of that side stream that extends back in time for many generations. And so there's a solidarity to be found there too.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. I think you're a bit more optimistic and perhaps a bit more open to those channels than I tend to be. And I appreciate that. What I particularly want to acknowledge, both as my view of what we're facing now and also what made your article stand out, was that never before in human history have we had such a self-caused and obviously going to happen collapse of Earth and human systems on a global scale. And ironically, I don't think we've had the opportunity to see how global and how intensely encased we are in the mental, the paradigm, in the mental construct of what it is to be a human being on the planet. In other words, what we're supposed to be doing here, what our collective calling is. We've never had to be introspective before. It's always just been the endless horizon and infinite growth on a finite planet. And I think you do a tremendous job of pointing at one of the most obvious breakdown points of that entire paradigm. And in the way that you point out the U.S. military as just a graphic and horrible example at the center of the paradigm. So
well, it's atrocious, and nothing has existed on that scale before of destructiveness. I mean, that is unprecedented.
Right. Yeah. I'm curious if you had the ability to just summarize what you're seeing, and if this audience was basically just sitting on the edge of our seats, if we're all sitting on the edge of our seats waiting for how you might summarize what you're seeing in the world, and also what you might suggest to folks who don't know quite as much as you do, don't have the history and wisdom that you've got, what you might suggest for folks who want to keep moving forward on this kind of path to wokeness. You have any suggestions?
I mean, first of all, I would say that question, and then question some more is a really good start when it comes to any of the received wisdom or broadcasted stuff that we're getting. I mean, before it was just sort of television that was giving us these messages. Now we're carrying it around in our pockets and looking at it all day long, and very particular views are being given to us through the media, and it's a very narrow set of views, and the world and the set of possibilities that exist is much, much larger than the narrowness that we're seeing, and so constantly questioning what it is that we're being told by the news, by our families, by religious leaders, by any of these people. I think questioning constantly is really important. I think that we need to be skeptical of scientists as well, of everyone who was still thinking within the system, who's still thinking within the narrow confines. Because at this point in history, where we're at is whether we're religious people or not as individuals, we are living in a time that's been shaped by the monotheistic religions that came out of the agricultural era. First the Hebrews, then the Christians, then the Muslims. And then of course there's individuals within all of these religions who are good people and do good things for the world. And those are the sorts of people who would be good people and be doing good things for the world if that religion didn't exist either, I think, as well. But those religions, first of all, defined the world as being a place that was no longer sacred, that anything that would be sacred, anything existed outside of the world. They invented this God and put him up in heaven. The previous views to that imbued the whole world. The previous indigenous views imbued the whole world with sacredness, the whole world with aliveness, if you prefer that word instead, the whole world with consciousness. It was then religion, those Western religions, that took it out and put it away from there. Then Western science actually picked up from that, and in its modern reductionism, still looks at things the same, looks at plants as being inert, looks at animals as, well, maybe they're conscious, maybe they're intelligent, et cetera, et cetera. Certainly doesn't look at the stones as being alive as Native Americans did. And so that way of viewing the world that existed for, almost 200,000 years before it switched off like 10 or 11,000 years ago. I mean, that's still the default. That's still the default of where we should be starting when we're looking at things. And so anything in our modern, contemporary worldview that's keeping us away from that is something to question. And the scientists are very good at measuring the things that can be measured, and they've been doing a really good job of showing how temperatures are going up, of how carbon is going up, of how the oceans are acidifying, of how agricultural chemicals are bad for animals. But they're very good at all of that. They're less good at seeing how to break out of that set of destructive practices, and they're also not good at looking at themselves and how their own personal prejudices are affecting their own work. For example, many climate scientists are probably not giving us the full deal because they themselves are in denial about it, for example. So basically, I would say that we need to look at the big picture, see how it affects ourselves, see how this culture that we live in is giving us a completely inaccurate view of the world, and then try to struggle towards getting a more accurate view of it ourselves. I think that going out into nature is a good way of doing that. But that doesn't have to mean going out to the countryside either. I mean, just sitting under a tree, turning off your phone, and listening to the birds, while we still have them, and that those would be the first steps I would say to take.
Yeah, beautiful, just beautiful. I've got to say, this has been an unexpected pleasure to connect with you and to see just how much resonance we have between us. And I look forward to whatever else you might post on CounterPunch. Kollibri, I'm wondering, are there other places where you post your writing? Is there another way that people can connect with your writing or anything else that you'd like to tell us about?
Yeah, I have a blog and I put everything up there, and then some of that goes to CounterPunch and other places. And the blog is called maxkamoksha.com, and that's spelled MACSKAMOKSHA.com, maxkamoksha.com. And you can, if you go to the CounterPunch article at the bottom, it has that spelled out too, under the author.
And I'll be sure to post all that information in the show notes of this particular episode.
Yeah, that's the easiest way to do it. And I post everything I do there first, and then sometimes it also goes to other places. I also take a lot of pictures, and I'll do a lot of photography of a lot of the things that I see. So
great. Well, Kollibri Terre Sonnenblume, thank you so much for taking time to speak with us. I am inspired by your writing. I'm blown away that so few people do what you have done, at least in that one article about, just pointing out the extraordinarily large elements that no one else is pointing to. Thank you for your work and how you see and hold the world. I definitely appreciate the amount of heart that you've just shared with us as you've kind of given us a sense of direction that you might suggest. And thanks so much for your time. And I hope we can get together and chat again soon.
Thank you, Dean. I really appreciate it. You having me on your podcast. And I do end up in your part of the world sometime, and so maybe we can meet up in person sometime.
Absolutely. Please send me an email. We will connect. Brother, thank you so much for your work.
Yeah, thank you, brother. I'll talk to you later.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast. Produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Music today from Michael Hedges, as always, and also Port Blue Into the Sea. Also available on our website, www.livingresilience.net, is a wide array of articles, online learning series, arranging group and individual resilience coaching, and sign up for our every other Tuesday free support group that we call Safe Circle Calls.